We are at the start of the 2015 college football season. It does not get better than this. The season gets underway tomorrow night, starts at 6 o'clock. We have a full weekend of games. I can't wait. I'm going to give you my predictions for some of the big matchups on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Let's start tomorrow night, 6 o'clock, South Carolina and North Carolina. It's going to come down to which defense shows up. You look at South Carolina overall last year, they gave up over 30 points per game. They allowed 212 rushing yards per game. This was a defense that only had 14 sacks through 13 ball games, but more importantly, they allowed opposing quarterbacks to complete over 61% of their passes. You look at North Carolina, they lost 7 games last year. In those 7 losses, the defense gave up 46.5 points per game, 523 total yards per game. On the year, they gave up 240 rushing yards per game, and more importantly, they allowed their opponents to convert on third downs 49% of the time. They do get a boost at defensive coordinator Gene Chizik, and both offenses are explosive. North Carolina averaged 33 points per game. They have a dynamic quarterback in Marquise Williams that accounted for 21 touchdowns. He's got a big play wide receiver in Ryan Switzer. On the flip side, you look at quarterback Connor Mitch making the start. He has a big play wide receiver in Pharaoh Cooper, who could possibly be the best wide receiver in the SEC. This game, to me, though, does come down to the defensive front. Which team is better overall? In my opinion, I give the slight edge to South Carolina, and more importantly, I give the coaching edge to Steve Spurrier and that staff. I think South Carolina gets a very hard-fought 7-point victory. I think it's a very high-scoring game, though. Calling for South Carolina 47, North Carolina 40, in a very tough matchup played on a neutral field in Charlotte. Michigan and Jim Harbaugh traveled to Salt Lake City to take on Kyle Whittingham and the Utah Utes. It's a rematch of last year's matchup in Ann Arbor, which Utah won 26-10. They dominated that game. But you look at Michigan overall in 2014, bitten by the turnover bug. This was a team that was minus 16 in turnover margin, which was 121st of 128 teams in FBS. But very disciplined team. Defensively, they only gave up 311 total yards per game, top 15 defense statistically, and only committed 3.5 penalties per game. Jim Harbaugh, he's a disciplinarian. He likes to run the football. He gets a boost at the quarterback position with Iowa transfer Jake Rudock. Still hasn't named the starter to date, but if you're asking me, I think he goes with Rudock because of the game experience. This team needs to run the football with running back Green. Offensive line did a pretty good job last year. They averaged 162 rushing yards per game, but they could not get it done on the road, only averaging 119 rushing yards per game. But you look at this Utah team overall. They were 6-1 on the road and 3-3 at home. They were a much better road team than they were a home team last year. In those 3 losses, they committed 9 turnovers. They do get a senior quarterback in Travis Wilson coming back. Kendall Thompson is back too, coming off an injury. But this offense revolves solely around running back Devontae Booker. They average 190 rushing yards per game, had problems stretching teams vertically, and only average 191 passing yards per game. If Utah falls behind, they're not a come-from-behind team. You can look at that Oregon game, Arizona State and Arizona. Once they fell behind, they had problems catching up, so not built in the same way of a high-octane offense. Defensively, they lose sack leader Nate Orchard, who led that team with 18.5 sacks. This was a team that led FBS in total sacks with 55. But I think Michigan does get the victory on the road in Salt Lake City. I think it's a very hard-fought game. I think it's low-scoring. I think it's Michigan 24, Utah 20. Very tough game, but Utah does drop that game at home. Michigan gets the upset in Jim Harbaugh's first game as Wolverine head coach. Another interesting matchup is TCU, Minnesota. TCU has their eyes set on a possible playoff. They returned 10 starters on offense, only 5 on defense. Gary Patterson, a defensive-minded coach, built this team from the defense out. Very solid in turnover margin last year. They were plus 18 and solid in run support, only giving up 120 rushing yards per game. You look at their quarterback, Trev Boykin, he's a dynamic player that has speed on the edge. And you look at this offense overall, they average 326 passing yards per game, 212 rushing yards per game, very balanced. You look at Minnesota. Defensively, they were solid. They were plus 10 in turnover margin, but more importantly, plus 12 in turnover margin at home or on a neutral field site. And their quarterback, Mitch Leidner, came on as the season progressed, but he still had problems stretching teams vertically. Minnesota only averaged 141 passing yards per game. That ranked 121st of 128 teams in FBS. And I look at Minnesota the same way I look at Kansas State. Very disciplined, very solid in run support, but they do not have the speed on the edge to cover the perimeter against a team like TCU. If Minnesota falls behind in this game, I think it's going to be a long day. You look at Minnesota's troubles in the Buffalo Wild Wings game last year, the bowl loss to Missouri with a very mobile quarterback in Matty Mock. The speed of Missouri gave Minnesota problems. I think it's the same type of matchup for TCU. I think they start fast, put a lot of pressure on that defense, and more importantly, a lot of pressure on Mitch Leidner and that offense, which only has 5 starters coming back. They don't have big play tight end Max Williams, and they don't have starting running back David Cobb, who moved on. So I think this is a very difficult spot for Minnesota. I think TCU does get a 24-point victory. I think it's high scoring. I think it's 44-20. TCU gets this victory in Minneapolis. Friday night has one game that piques my interest. It's Western Michigan over Michigan State. Now, I don't think Western Michigan gets the victory, but I think this game is a lot closer than people think. Let's look at Michigan State. Michigan State does not have defensive coordinator Pat Narduzzi, who's now the head coach at Pittsburgh. No big play wide receiver Tony Lippett. No running back Jeremy Langford from last year. I think this team is going to be very vanilla because of their week 2 matchup against Oregon in East Lansing. You look at this team overall in Western Michigan, they have the big 3. Quarterback Zach Terrell, who had 26 touchdowns last year. Running back Javorian Franklin, who led the MAC with 1,595 rushing yards and 24 touchdowns. And big play wide receiver Corey Davis that had 1,408 receiving yards and 16 touchdowns. This is going to be the biggest game on Western Michigan's schedule all year long. It's a home game for Western Michigan. It's an interstate rivalry game. And I just think that the Western Michigan will be in this game from start to finish. Hicks does come back from Michigan State, the cornerback that had mononucleosis, but how healthy is he? They lose linebacker Davis to an ACL injury, so I think this is going to be a very tough game for Michigan State. I don't think head coach D'Antonio wants to show a lot with his week 2 matchup of Oregon. I know they'll be focused, but I think if Michigan State jumps up early, they just hold back on the reins, and I think Western Michigan's in this game from start to finish. In the end, though, I think Michigan State gets a hard-fought 27-20 victory on the road, week number 1. Saturday, unbelievable slate of games. Let's start with one game that really piques my interest, BYU and Nebraska. BYU returning quarterback Taysom Hill, who's coming off an ACL injury. Taysom Hill led that team to a 4-0 record before he got hurt against Utah State. The team then proceeded to lose that Utah State game and 3 other games afterwards with quarterback Christian Stewart. But BYU only beat one team with a winning record in 2014. That was Houston. This is a team that revolves solely around quarterback Taysom Hill. Running back Jamal Williams is out. He left the team due to personal reasons. It's going to be a very difficult spot for BYU. I know they have a very heavy offense and defensive lines. Those kids are mature. And I know Nebraska does have 5 suspensions that are unnamed at this point. But I still like Nebraska in this matchup. You look at BYU overall, Taysom Hill coming off an ACL injury. I know he's healthy according to the media outlets, but I need to see that. I need to see how confident Taysom Hill is on that knee. That offense revolves solely around him, and that's why I like Nebraska and quarterback Tommy Armstrong. I think they have the weapons on the outside. Although they lose Kenny Bell, This defense needs to step up defensively. They gave up 177 rushing yards per game last year. That was with big play defensive end Randy Gregory, and they did not beat a top 25 opponent. They were 0-4. But Mike Riley's a good game planner. They're playing at home in Lincoln, the start of a new regime, and I think Nebraska and Tommy Armstrong dominate this game. I think they start fast and pull away with this game, put a lot of pressure on Taysom Hill, plus the speed of that defense for BYU, not up to par in my opinion. I think Nebraska pulls away with this one, 41-27. Nebraska gets the victory at home in Memorial Stadium. Very hard-fought game, but in the end, Nebraska has way too much offense for BYU. Nebraska 41, BYU 27. Another interesting game is Penn State traveling to Temple. Penn State hasn't lost to Temple since 1941. The last 4 victories over the Owls have been by an average margin of 10.2 points per game, including last year's 30-13 victory over the Owls in Happy Valley. This was a Penn State offense last year that struggled due to offensive line issues. They had 43 total sacks allowed, one of the worst units in college football. They only averaged 102 rushing yards per game, which was the lowest total in the previous 6 years for Penn State. That put a lot of pressure on Christian Hackenberg, who threw for 12 touchdowns, 15 INTs last year, but 4 of those touchdowns came in the bowl victory against Boston College at the end of the year. So not a very productive season by Christian Hackenberg. They're going to be facing an Owl team that has 19 starters coming back, 9 on offense, 10 on defense, led by dual threat quarterback P.J. Walker, who has a big arm. On defense, very solid. This was a team that was +5 in turnover margin, only gave up 183 passing yards per game, and I think this team will be disciplined in Temple. Very disciplined on the offensive line, defensive line. They have a big play linebacker in Tyler Matakevich, and I think Penn State drops this game, calling for the upset. Temple knocks off Penn State 24-21 in Philadelphia. I think it's going to be a very difficult game for Penn State on the road. When you look at Temple overall, very solid on the offensive line as well. Protected P.J. Walker last year. He can break, contain, and give Penn State some issues. Another game I'm looking at that I really feel strongly about, 2 games actually, but one is taking place in South Bend. I really like Texas over Notre Dame. Charlie Strong, big game head coach. He's a game planner. This was a Texas team last year that got outscored in the second half of their 7 losses by a margin of 132-41. They had the 11th best secondary, though, in college football, only giving up 184 passing yards per game. One thing Charlie Strong is, he's a disciplinarian. He's going to go with 2 quarterbacks in this game, Tyrone Swoops and Gerard Hurd, and I like the athleticism by Texas in this game. They were -3 in turnover margin, but they're going to be going up against a Notre Dame team that struggled last year. They started out 6-0. They dropped 5 of their last 6 games before that season-ending bowl victory to LSU. In those 5 games down the stretch, the defense allowed 41.8 points per game. They gave up 187 rushing yards per game and a total of 453 total yards per game in those 5 losses. From a speed perspective, Texas matches up very well against Notre Dame. The last time these teams played was 1996. Notre Dame got the victory. We're talking back in the day with Ron Powlus and Autry Denson, talking back in the day of Ricky Williams and James Brown for Texas. Big players for their respective teams, but I like Charlie Strong in this matchup. I think he's a better defensive game planner than Brian Kelly. I'm calling for the upset. Texas 27, Notre Dame 20. I think it puts a lot of pressure on Malik Zaire, no Everett Golson. I know he's got 2 big play wide receivers in Corey Fuller and Robinson, but I think this is going to be a very difficult game for Notre Dame, week number 1, under the lights. It's a 7:30 start. Another game I like is Arizona State over Texas A&M. A lot of people high on Texas A&M. I don't see it. They were -7 in turnover margin. John Chavis, the LSU D coordinator, comes over. This was a team last year in Texas A&M that played a lot of zone coverage, not used to playing man-to-man, which is what John Chavis likes to play. Texas A&M were -7 in turnover margin last year. They're going to be going up against a high-octane offense in Arizona State with quarterback Mike Bercovici. Bercovici completed over 61% of his passes. He has running back Demario Richard and DJ Foster, who is working out of the slot this coming offseason. Keep an eye out for him to make up for the lack of production by Jalen Strong, who moved on to the NFL. But this was a team last year in Arizona State that was +14 in turnover margin. They were +9 in turnover margin on the road or on a neutral field site. They were 4-2 against top 25 competition, and more importantly, played very well on the road last year with a 5-2 overall mark. I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on the offense, on the defense for Texas A&M to cover that team. And you look at Arizona State's defense, they have two big play defensive tackles in Smallwood and Lafu that are going to put a lot of pressure on the offensive line for Texas A&M. I think Arizona State's going to be very difficult to run on this year, and I'm calling for the upset. I think it's high scoring as well. I'm calling for Arizona State to get the upset 41-34 over Texas A&M. I know Kyle Allen comes back, Trey Carson, Speedy Nolan, Josh Reynolds for Texas A&M, but I like the overall team by Arizona State, and I think they get the 7-point victory over A&M on Saturday. That's on a neutral field site as well. And then this game, I've said it since basically the end of May. I really feel strongly about this game, calling for the upset. It's game day is there. Alabama hasn't lost an opening season game since 2001. Who do they lose to? UCLA with quarterback Corey Pauls and Skip Hicks. That came when Andrew Zhao and Freddie Millions were playing for the Crimson Tide. They dropped that game on the road week number 1 of 2001. But Alabama's won 13 straight season openers by an average margin of victory of 24.2 points per game. I've said it all offseason. This was not the same Alabama team that we've seen in years past. They were -2 in turnover margin for the first time since prior to 2008. They gave up 104 rushing yards per game, which seems like a dominant statistic. However, against the better teams in the SEC, they gave up 136 to Mississippi State, 181 to Tennessee, 183 to LSU, 174 to Auburn, and in the college football playoff, 281 rushing yards to Ezekiel Elliott and Ohio State. Offensively, they only returned 3 starters. No TJ Yeldon, no Christian Jones, no DeAndrew White, no Amari Cooper. Not a veteran wide receiver core like they had last year. And you look at the overall quarterback situation, I think it'll be Jacob Coker, although nobody's mentioned it to date. Look for Nick Saban to go with some sort of experience in this game. I look for Lane Kiffin and the staff to turn to Coker week number 1. It's going to take a while to get that cohesiveness that they had last year down. You can't just plug in players and expect them to step up and play their A game week number 1. It takes them time to gel as a unit. Wisconsin can run the football. This was a team that put up 400 total rushing yards last year in the bowl victory in the Outback Bowl in the win over Auburn. I think this team will be confident. I think they'll be ready. They have a senior quarterback in Joel Stave. I know they have some offensive line issues, but from a defensive perspective, Wisconsin was very solid, only giving up 294 total yards per game. They're solid in the secondary. That team that only gave up 165 passing yards per game. Now, I know that's Big Ten competition, not SEC competition, but I expect Wisconsin to jump up early, put the pressure on that Alabama offense, and I'm calling for the upset. Keep in mind, Alabama won 7 games at home last year by an average margin of victory, 30 points per game. They were 5-2 on the road last year. 5 of those victories came by an average margin of victory of 12.2 points per game. A significant team on the road than they were at home last year. This game is in Dallas. It's on a neutral field site, and they've had Great success under Nick Saban in terms of stepping up these week one games. But in this game, I think Wisconsin does strike the upset. I'm not sold on Alabama. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But I think Wisconsin gets the upset Saturday night. I think they put up a 31 spot. I think it's Wisconsin 31, Alabama 24. Dominant victory by Wisconsin. This is why we love the games. This is why we love talking about college football. You can catch my radio show on Yahoo Sports Radio Network every Saturday morning, 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. at streamysr.com, or go to my website, goforthe2.com. Have a great weekend. Have a great week, everyone. College football is the best.